To be honest, 1984 feels like a rather lean time for arcade games compared to the couple of years before it, at least outside of big and important releases like 1942, Marble Madness and Kung Fu Master. It certainly feels like there's less worthy Western games to look at, perhaps for obvious crash-related reasons. Still, we're not here to discuss the decline of the arcades in certain countries. We're here to pick out games and subjects from the time that are potentially interesting, whether they're titles that are very much still worthy of attention, or if they're somewhat intriguing failures, or if they're, well, just plain weird or bad ideas. I've still managed to fish out 10 or so entries for this video, and all those bases are thoroughly covered, so hopefully there's things here that interest you. Anyway, let's get started. I'm kicking things off with a game that I have covered before as part of a big look at the history of Gottlieb. However, I want to highlight it again here because simply, I consider it to be the single greatest laserdisc game of all time. You can keep your Dragon's Lairs, your Mad Dog McCree's and all that. They're frankly not even in the same league as Gottlieb's, or rather Milestar at the time, Us vs Lem. Us vs Lem was a pretty ambitious project that built off the success of Gottlieb's first laserdisc title, the excellent Mach 3, a decent quality shoot-'em-up that was enhanced by the addition of thoroughly exciting aerial footage shot by pilot Clay Lacey in his specially kitted out Astrovision airplane, and ended up being amongst the most successful laserdisc titles. Us vs Lem was the follow-up, sold by Milestar Electronics, the new name for Gottlieb since 1983, as a conversion kit for Mach 3 cabs, and it expands on the formula. Again, the primary gameplay is based around shoot-'em-up action, and it's far more advanced in this regard than the likes of the previous video's Cube Quest. We've got lots of variation in the gameplay, behind the ship stages, side-on stages, stages where you're dodging your way through forests or the energy barriers of the alien mothership. It's always changing things up, and that's really freaking welcome. It certainly keeps the game exciting. Also, this is one of the rare beasts in the world of laserdiscs where the gameplay and the presentation just go hand in hand. Both of them are just as good as each other, the game going all out with a wonderfully cheesy as all hell B-movie alien invasion plot, filled with overwrought acting, legitimately funny cutscenes and cheeky little jokes. I utterly adore silly little touches like the American Gothic reference, as well as a fantastic orchestral score. Honestly, as far as laserdisc games go, I struggle to find any fault at all in this game, and the two main folks behind it, Warren Davis of Qbert fame and concepts man Dennis Norden, did an absolutely bang-up job on every part of the game, with a special note going to Dave Zabriskie for fantastic work in the oral department. Alas, well, Us vs Lem couldn't have possibly come out at a worse time. It was June 1984 by the time the game went out on release. Unfortunately, the time of the laserdisc in the arcades was over at this point, and that old American crash, well, that was in full swing. Orders that distributors had placed for the game and a Mach 3 cab to place it in were now getting cancelled all over the shop, resulting in Milestar taking legal action against Bally, claiming they'd cancelled the orders unlawfully. A whole lot of money and time was spent on Us vs Lem, and as good as the end product was, sadly it was a huge disaster. Undeservedly so, but them's the breaks. The commercial failure of Us vs Lem was one of the reasons why, sadly, Coca-Cola and Columbia, the parent companies of Milestar, made the decision in September of 1984 to close it, bringing Gottlieb and Milestar's involvement in video games to an end, although the much longer-lived pinball part of the company was able to break off and survive under the guise of Premier technology. A shame, and it means that to this day Us vs Lem is still a pretty obscure title, barely seen on the floor back in the day and not exactly well known now. However, for me it is one you absolutely need to play. A total freaking gem, an example of a laserdisc game that's not just got top-notch production values, but has got the gameplay to match it. My absolute favourite laserdisc title. Nothing else comes close, not even Road Avenger. If you wish to know more about the game, as well as the entire history of Gottlieb and Milestar, with its various other classic titles like Qbert, Reactor and so on, I'll link my big video all about them in the description. It would be remiss of me to leave laserdiscs behind for now without covering this next game. Unsurprisingly, considering the year, it's another big commercial failure, but it is another highly ambitious laserdisc title. Rick Dyer was, of course, the man behind the initial laserdisc boom, the creator of Dragon's Lair and all that. It didn't take long for Dyer and his main collaborator, the genius animator Don Bluth, to follow that game up with another bout of finely animated QuickTime events, that being Space Ace. The adventures of Dexter are still well remembered, although the game wasn't quite as successful as Dragon's Lair was. And from there we go to Dyer's most ambitious project. The game itself was ambitious enough, but it was also supposed to be the first title for a whole new laserdisc-based console. The game in question is, of course, Thayer's Quest. Thayer's Quest was initially made for RDI Video Systems' new console, the Halcyon, a machine that, if it had been released fully, would have retailed at $2,500 and would have had the power to play double-sided laserdiscs among all sorts of other things, with Thayer's Quest taking advantage of that by featuring not just the same standard of animation that was found in the first two Rick Dyer games, but by having a whole lot more of it, befitting for a game that Dyer estimated would take players hundreds of hours to explore in full. This isn't just an ordinary QuickTime event affair after all, it's a whole adventure where you guide Thayer Alkenred through 3 of the 5 kingdoms ruled by the Elden Kins in order to find relics and restore a great amulet before an evil sorcerer named Sorcerbao gets to them. You can move freely through areas and pick up various objects to aid in your quest, so there's a whole load of different paths and a lot more controls. So much so in fact that the Thayer's Quest arcade cabinet would feature a keyboard for control, as opposed to a traditional joystick and buttons. Indeed, the arcade is the only place where Thayer's Quest would get any kind of release at the time. So much money was invested in the creation of the Halcyon, but with the current state of play in the States and with the coffers starting to run empty, it became clear that there'd need to be some sort of arcade release for the game to have any chance whatsoever. This arcade release required a bit of cutting down in order to fit the game onto a regular single-sided laserdisc, although it is still certainly a behemoth compared to other laserdisc titles. Still, by the time Thayer's Quest hit the arcade floor, the laser ship had well and truly sailed, and the game was not a hit in the slightest. Ultimately, while RDI were able to complete the Halcyon, they folded before the system was actually released, and only a small handful of machines ever made it out of the factory. As far as Thayer's Quest itself goes, I'm playing a later version of the title that was eventually released for DOS by Interplay in 1995, with the new name of Kingdom the Far Reaches. It's not quite the full arcade experience, but the game is a real pain in the arse to get going in MAME, and while some names have been changed here and there, and there's a bit of redubbing, the Apprentice mode is kind of close to the original arcade, although it's mainly controlled with a mouse as opposed to a keyboard. You can certainly see the game's ambition. There's a whole lot of places to go, and while the animation isn't quite at the level of what Don Bluth did with the previous titles, RDI's animators still did a fine job. It is certainly still as unforgiving as those titles are, if not even more so. It's very easy to simply make a completely wrong move into an area and, without warning, be utterly wrecked by some sort of spirit or trap without having any chance to get out, unless you've got the correct item. This isn't necessarily a bad thing the first couple of times, as you'll be sent back to the wizard Druce, or Daylon in Kingdom, who'll give you the latest batch of spells he's been working on. You'll need to have the powers of understanding, travelling, seeing and release to complete the quest, but you must be careful how you use the spells as they're only limited use. And of course, you've only got a few lives to play with. In the end, I can't say that Thayer's Quest is hugely a game for me, but I respect the clear passion that went into it. It's a tough thing indeed to do an in-depth adventure in the arcade, and while it's certainly doable, Namco managed it in this very year, albeit with a very different game known as the Tower of Joraga. It's tough to get right, and Thayer's Quest kind of falls down on the arcade side of things. The gameplay issues in the end are similarly shallow as what you'll find in Dragon's Lair, but here you kind of find yourself simply losing more slowly. With that said, the gaming world would be a much worse place if there weren't folks around to try these things out and ultimately fall short, even if they spent a few $1 million in the attempt. There's a lot to respect about Thayer's Quest, even if the game doesn't quite make it there.
I can't see a thing, not even my feet.
You now have everything you will need.
Exidy took a big spot in the 1983 video with the excellent Crossbow, a big step forward for the gun game genre. Now, while I could continue on with Exidy's gun games and look at their second title in the genre from this year, Cheyenne, I've got something different. Not so much a game, more a bit of hardware. The Exidy Maxiflex. What's that, you wonder? Well, it's interchangeable arcade kit, basically. You've got a generic cabinet, and inside it you've essentially got an Atari 600XL computer, which was one half of Atari's latest duo of the 8-bit line. The 600XL was the successor to the 400, and the 800XL was naturally the successor to the 800. The Maxiflex tends to come in for a bit of stick, seeing as this hardware would obviously be pretty underpowered compared to arcades of the time. However, there was a definite soundness to the logic, seeing as the Maxiflex was one of the first arcade systems to be based off of a home computer or a console, hitting the floor at around about the same time as Nintendo's Versus system. While the Maxiflex may be largely forgotten, the Versus system was a big Western hit, more so than it was in Japan, and it proved to be a crucial step in laying the groundwork for the NES's arrival in the States. Once again, I am referring a fair bit here to the Golden Age arcade historian's exceptional multi-part history of Exidy. Once again, I will link this in the description and I highly recommend reading it. The whole thing came about through a deal between Exidy and Atari 8-bit game makers First Star, and the main principle behind creating the Maxiflex was, as you may expect, to try and combat the effects of the crash. Exidy reasoned that cash-strapped operators, particularly in street locations, diners, bars and what have you, could be willing to pony up for what is essentially 4 games in one cabinet at a cost of just under $2,000 per unit that customers stuck a quarter into in order to get 300 seconds of playtime. Alas, they weren't quite willing in this instance. There were 4 Maxiflex games representing the quartet of previously released Atari 8-bit titles that were part of the initial deal: Astro Chase, Boulder Dash, Bristles and Flip and Flop. All 4 of these games are actually pretty worthy in their own way, with Flip and Flop especially being a very intriguing and rather head-spinning twist on the Q*bert formula, but the big ticket item here is obviously Boulder Dash. Peter Leaper's title was First Star's biggest success after all, and this represents Boulder Dash's first appearance in the arcade. While this one wasn't a success, First Star would license the game out not long after to Data East, who'd make a version of the game for their own interchangeable arcade kit, the Deco cassette system, in 1985, as well as creating another game in the series, confusingly also simply called Boulder Dash, for the arcades in 1990. These releases did prove to be more successful than the original one on the old Maxiflex, which didn't make it close to the 1,500 units that Exidy were required to sell in 1984 for the agreement with First Star to continue. But still, this bit of kit does have its place in arcade history. Next up, we're off to Europe, and specifically we're off to Italy for our first, and indeed only, look at a game by Zaccaria. There was a time when these fellas from Bologna were pretty big, more so in the world of pinball than the world of arcades, where they produced an awful lot of tables and were, by some distance, the biggest pinball company in Europe, exporting their pins all over the world. Still, they were most certainly around in video games, even if a lot of the cabinets they released were copies or rip-offs of other titles. There's Zaccaria versions of Crazy Con, Pac-Man, or Puckman in this instance, Space Invaders and various others, along with other releases that were officially licensed. They do also have a few originals kicking about, and the game we're looking at here is one of the last video games they released to the arcades, Jackrabbit. As an idea, Jackrabbit isn't wholly original. It's very much inspired by the Q*bert formula, with a bunny jumping on tiles on an isometric grid, picking up as many carrots as he can and avoiding various other animals, letting out a big old digitised "ay ay ay" whenever he gets caught. We do get a bit of variation, mind you. There are 3 separate stages, a flat single screen affair, a horizontal scroller where you've got to outrun the screen as well as the animals, and another single screen stage that's got various levels to it and needs to be figured out a bit. The bunny can't effortlessly jump from step to step in the same way that Q*bert can. It's a simple enough affair, but I actually find it to be quite likeable. The graphics and sound are pretty cute. Most of Zacharya's originals aren't hugely worthy of note in all honesty, as they're often quite derivative, but I've got a bit of time for this one, and it's definitely my favourite of theirs. As mentioned, it's one of the company's final arcade titles, and certainly their last original game. Not long after this, Zacharya left the video game world to concentrate solely on pins once again, later operating under the new name of Mr. Game for their last couple of years, and eventually closing for good in 1990. However, the Zacharya factory would be sold on to a San Marino-based company called Technoplay, who would become the official distributor of Sega arcades and amusements in Italy, as well as continuing to operate in the pinball world, where they officially distribute Stern's tables. This company is still very much around today. We've got a run of pretty decent Japanese titles coming up, and we're starting with Chinese Hero. This is a lovely top-down 2-player beat-em-up. You've got to rescue Princess Min from monsters who've taken her and a bunch of treasures, and you do so with a whole lot of punches and flying kicks. The concept sound and the game is full of personality. The graphics for 1984 are especially lovely, and there's lots of cool designs on the enemies and stages. Not too difficult an arcade game either, so it's one that you can spend a decent amount of time with. You may well know this game already, although perhaps not in its arcade guise. It got a release on the Famicom in 1986, eventually coming out for the NES in North America in 1989 under the name of Kung Fu Heroes. It's the first game in a series known as Super Chinese. Chinese Hero is the only time the series appeared on the arcade floor, but there's lots of other games in the series, all of which came out on various Nintendo consoles, and most of which never left Japan. The game itself is by a company that, at the time, was called Nihon Game Corporation, and they tended to release arcade games under the branding of Thayer System, a fair few of which were indeed published by the very similarly named Taito. In 1987, they changed their name to what they're much better known as, that being Culture Brain, and while they've long stopped making arcade titles, they're still around today, having changed their name back to the original Nihon Game Corporation in 2021. Here's another game that represents the beginning of a series, and another one that started with a couple of arcade games before largely appearing on consoles thereafter. This is Ninja-Kun Majou no Boken, which translates to Ninja-Kun Adventures in Dark Castle, although the game is much better known in the West as Ninja Kit. This series has very rarely left Japan. It's only in recent times that this first title has been released in the West through the Arcade Archive series, although the 1987 sequel, Ninja Kid Ashura no Sho, did get a Western arcade release under the name of Rad Action. Anywho, this is a pretty okay beat-em-up. It's quite short, seeing as it only consists of 3 upward-scrolling levels that repeat, but the simple goal, much like Chinese Hero, is to take out all the other enemies on screen using your shurikens, and also stunning them with a jump on their heads. Of course, these villains can do the exact same thing to you, and they've also got a few more weapons at their disposal, especially as you continue to loop through the game. In all honesty, it's kind of basic, although a quick enough title to be an entertaining little distraction. The studio behind this game is called UPL, and they were an offshoot of Universal, the folks behind Mr. Do and all of that. UPL stands for Universal Playland. UPL do have a couple of fairly well-known arcade titles under their belt, and a few of them were certainly a bit unconventional, so we'll definitely be seeing them again as we make our way through the years. How about a couple of games from Nichibutsu? We actually haven't seen these guys since they graced the 1980 video with the double whammy of Crazy Climber and Mooncrester, but here they are again with a double bill of titles that aren't nearly as well known as that duo, but I think are pretty cool. First up, we've got Itazura Tenshi, which translates to Lovely Angel. This is a multi-directional space shooter that, to me, is somewhat similar to Namco's Bosconian, although the end goal is a little different and the presentation kind of unusual. The aim here is to control Cupid and touch the stars in each area. Once you've touched all the stars, you've made a constellation, and you get a lovely little cutscene showing it off. Very nice for the time at any rate. For the most part, Cupid actually can't fire at the various enemies chasing him, although he can pick up ammunition for his bow and arrow, which will allow you to fight back for a limited time. Otherwise, progression through the game without getting caught requires pretty precise movement and prompt acquisition of power-ups, as generally a lot of these badniks are either quicker than you, or they'll do very annoying things like removing your progress at joining up a constellation. Even if space shooters were 10 a penny at this time, this one does stand out a little due to having a bit more of a unique aim and presentation about it. It is quite nice to be in this setting and actually not having to just take on an alien armada with a spaceship for a change. Decent stuff, and you can also grab this game through the Arcade Archives collection, if you wish. Up next from Nichibutsu? Well, do you remember the almighty Mega Drive classic, that is Skitchin'? You know, it's like Road Rash, only even more extreme in presentation, allowing you to punch other skaters and hang on to cars and all of that. Well, how do you fancy playing a game that's quite a lot like Skitchin', only it's an arcade that came out a decade before EA's title? If you like the sound of that, then say hello to Roller Jammer. This came out through Nichibutsu's USA division, and unlike their other releases, I am pretty sure that this title never graced Japanese shores. First up, you go through a time trial where you avoid flags or spikes or whatnot, and set a time that determines how many seconds are on the clock for the proper action afterwards, where you get on the track and try to pass a set amount of skaters before the timer runs out. You're helped in this regard by being able to punch your opponents as you try to pass them, although obviously they can punch you back. Still, if you're able to avoid that, you get more points for each one you hit, also collecting extra points and time bonuses along the way. Each stage is populated by a different gang that's got a name like Mad Smashers, Wild Bruisers or whatever, and you repeat the time trial whenever you move up a class. On the whole, this game's really cool. Nothing complex about it or anything, it's just entertaining button bashing action, filled with the various joys of punching people in the face, but minus any of the rather vexatious legal repercussions. Moves quite niftily too, and has catchy music. This is definitely one to play, and once again, it's available through Arcade Archives. You know what's not available through Arcade Archives? This next game that we're covering, and honestly there's probably good reasons for that. Still, it rolls along nicely from the last game because, well, do you want to make some crazy money? Well, instead of doing the usual thing and booting up Crazy Taxi, riding through San Francisco and going gaga to All I Want in the same way you've surely done so many times before, why don't you instead play an exceptionally ropey and obscure Japanese arcade game from 1984 called Taxi Driver? I mean, it's basically the same thing after all. This game is somewhat like Rally X, only a lot slower. You have to drive through a town to the various dots, pick up passengers by stopping next to them, and then take them to wherever they need to go. Ideally, you don't accrue too many penalty points along the way. You get these by speeding or driving on the wrong side of the road, and if you get too many, the cops will come after you. Naturally, there's a few other obstacles, other cars, roadworks, water and so on, and you've got to keep an eye on your fuel gauge, use the gas station when you need to. Honestly, the game is pretty bad. Really slow and choppy, with largely bare roads and holy naff standard of presentation. Almost kind of endearingly rubbish, especially by 1984 standards, but certainly not something I would recommend. Indeed, if you fancy playing a taxi-centric arcade game of this vintage, I would highly advise you to play Data East's Kamikaze Cabby, or Yellow Cab, instead, which is leagues better in every conceivable way and also came out in 1984. So yeah, no wonder this game's so obscure. Interestingly, it was made by a very short-lived label called Graphic Techno EW, EW standing for East and West, that actually was a combination of two other businesses, Saibu Lease and Vic Tokai. I believe that Saibu Lease's main business was the running of game centres, and while you do likely know Vic Tokai due to their games, the company's primary business was, and indeed still is, in telecommunications. I am pretty sure that this is the only arcade game that Vic Tokai was ever involved in, and they were obviously a lot more successful when it came to making console titles. Our final entry takes us back to the States, and again we're dealing more with a line of specific arcades rather than one single and, frankly, not very good game. This is a licensed affair, and it's the Berenstain Bears in Big Paw's Cave. This game is, well, it's a very simplistic and not exactly good looking one. You control Brother Bear, and you make your way up through this twisty corridor. You collect toys on the way, occasionally avoid the odd bat or stalactite, sneak past Big Paw at the end, and find the pots of honey that he's nicked. You do this once, and then it pretty much just repeats, only the levels get a little bit longer. Not much else to it really, and it is easy enough to just flat out dismiss this as, complete garbage in every way. However, there is a little bit more to it than that. First off, there's rarity. This is a virtually unknown game nowadays, obscure to the point where there's only one known cabinet of the game out there. Said cabinet does not possess the overlay that the title would have used, which is why the graphics look, well, so utterly bare and awful for the time. There would have been a bit more to look at if we had the overlay, but it hasn't been found, and in all honesty, well, it's not likely to be found, for reasons we'll get into. The big rabbit hole here is the purpose of Big Paw's Cave, and who it was marketed to. This is a game designed for very young children, between the ages of 3 to 8 years old, going by the game's flyers. Now, generally speaking, arcades in the Golden Age, a couple of examples that we'll get into aside, weren't thought of as places for kids of that age. Not to say that no young child ever went in there with their parents, of course, but a typical arcade of the time would have had teenagers as its main audience. That and, hell, a regular-sized arcade cab would often just be too plain big for the brats to actually play on in the first place. Little Johnny's going to have trouble reaching those controls. However, an Arizona company called Entertech had other ideas, and they released games for a special line of cabs they made called Moppet Video. These games, including the likes of Tugboat, Pirate Treasure, Desert Race, Noah's Ark and Leprechaun, were all designed with the aforementioned young age group in mind, as was the cabinet. A Moppet Video cab is around a mere 4 foot tall, nearly a foot smaller than a typical cabaret cab, and 2 feet smaller than a regular arcade cab. Entertech had 2 major arcade buyers who, by all accounts, they sold just about all of their machines to: Chuck E. Cheese and its main rival, Showbiz Pizza. What with these chains being so much more family-oriented than the typical arcade was, these havens of cool animatronics and cardboard pizza were just about exclusively the places where you could find these Moppet Video cabs, and this is also the main reason why they're so hard to come across nowadays. It was the policy of both Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz restaurants, once they were finished with a game, to destroy them. The reasons vary as to why they did this. Either it's for reasons of taxation that they didn't care to sell them on, or that they didn't want to potentially sell the games to a competing business. Either way, a machine at Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz, once there, was almost certainly doomed to end its days by being shipped off to a killing floor, where they would be duly smashed to smithereens. They'd only be saved by things like the odd franchisee bucking policy, or creative thieves taking them away for servicing, if the stories I've seen are true. Sadly, destruction was the fate of the high majority of cabs in Entertech's Moppet video range, and as such they're all exceptionally difficult to come by nowadays, with Berenstain Bears in particular being rarer than hen's teeth because it was the last game in the Moppet video line. It even comes with wholly different cabinet art than the rest of the Moppet line, just to ram the obscurity home. And so, even if Berenstain Bears in Big Paw's Cave as a game isn't exactly much to speak of at all, it represents its own unique little strand of arcade history, one that has, unfortunately, been largely eviscerated by the practices of the time. And that's another year in the books. 1984 may not have been a banner year for the arcade world, but it's certainly been an intriguing one, filled as it has been with games and projects that people certainly put a fair amount into, even if a lot of them didn't end up being successful. While we say goodbye to laserdiscs for now, there will be new avenues to explore next year, including the great mystery of just what was going on in arcades behind the Iron Curtain. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.